important is that it's kind of like an energy sponge. If you're going to heat up gasoline, because the molecules don't stick together, all you have to do is put a little bit of energy into the system and it will vaporize. Right? Those molecules they're not sticking together firmly. They're going to go from a liquid to a gas very easily. But in order to get water to vaporize, even though it's a very small molecule, in order to get water to vaporize, you have to heat it up a lot. You have to stick it on the stove and turn on the fire or turn on the electricity and sit there forever while it takes the water to boil. Because you have to put a lot of energy. The water has to get very hot before there's enough energy in the system and before those molecules are vibrating quickly enough to break apart. Yes? So liquid water can hold a lot of heat before it vaporizes, right? And what that means is that it keeps the temperature of the planet very stable. So at night, it can release some of that heat. It's like a heat sponge. Some of that heat gets released to keep the temperature from dropping too much. During the day, it's absorbing heat that might otherwise make the atmosphere get very hot. Okay, because the water has this specific heat. It's got a very high specific heat. So this is really, this idea of hydrogen bonding is really important because of all the chemical reactions that happen in water, but it's also part of what makes our world so temperate, keeps our temperatures so pleasant, particularly in the Bay Area. Yes? Where in August we can wear a light jacket. I spent part of my summer in Moab, Utah. It's like 107 one day. It's really hot. We were hiking. It's really hot to be hiking. Another really just weird thing about water is the fact that when water molecules, because they're attracted to each other, so you have your liquid water and the water molecules are hydrogen bonding. As water gets colder, it actually gets closer together until it forms ice. And then when it forms ice and when it forms the crystals, it gets less dense. The crystal structure forces the water molecules a little further apart. And so ice floats on the surface of water. And this is really important. If ice froze from the bottom up, what you end up with are these solid frozen parts of the earth. But what you end up with are layers of ice on top and living things that are able to stay in the colder liquid water down below. Yes? Kind of cool, right? So this is also very important. This idea that when you have a glass of water, the ice floats to the top. You know, it's colder, you'd think the molecules would be closer together and they'd sink, but they don't. So this characteristic of water is also really important to life, because so much of life is in the bottom of the ocean. Thinking about those hydrothermal vents, right? And the question of whether or not maybe that's even where life arose. So it could be this is even more important than I'm stating here. We'll know someday. All right, continuing just to talk about water and what it does and why it's important. Water is a great solvent. So here we have a salt crystal. This is sodium chloride. The little green balls are sodium, the yellow ones are chloride. Right? You sprinkle it on your French fries. Everybody's hungry now. All right, well, what happens when this gets into water? If you take a little salt and you put it in water, if you do nothing, eventually the salt is going to dissolve in the water, right? If you stir it, put a little energy in the system, it'll happen more quickly. What happens here is that water molecules, because they have a negatively charged end and a positively charged end, they can form, we call these shells of hydration. So they can kind of align themselves so that around the positively charged sodium atom, you have negatively charged water. Around the negatively charged chloride ion, you have positively charged end of water. So that makes these molecules dissolve in water. So whereas the crystal in your salt shaker is a solid, once it gets into water, these ions are going to break apart and dissolve into the water and be hydrated. So water, this is what a solvent does. It surrounds the molecule and keeps it in solution. Okay? So this is when water is thinking of it as a solvent, where things can be dissolved in water. And you know, if you cry and you lick your tears, you can taste the solvent, right? So you know there's things other than water in there. So solvent is the water, a solute is something that's dissolved in the water. So here's if you took hydrochloric acid, that dissolves in water, or sodium hydroxide, those would dissolve in water to form acids and bases, and then sodium chloride is a salt. Okay? Lots of salt in your cells. Hopefully not as much of these guys, because that could be bad. All right, again, just kind of helping you jog your memory here from chemistry. I like this one. This is, he says, I just love hanging out with you, chloride. Hee, sodium. Oh, no, is that water? What? Where? And they still never forget you. Separated. Getting dissolved can be traumatizing. Cute. Scientists don't have great sense of humor, but you know, you're into that kind of thing. It works for me. Okay, so that's sort of my little review of inorganic chemistry. The part that's important to water, to biology, is the water. What about organic molecules? Biologists are always thinking about organic chemistry, so this is where we're really at home. Organic molecules, when we think about them, we tend to think about molecules that have carbon skeletons. And hanging off the carbon skeleton, here's our little skeleton of carbon, right, are functional groups. So, for example, if the functional group is a hydroxyl group, it would be an alcohol, right? And lots of alcohols, OH groups in your system. Glucose, for example, has lots of OH groups off the carbon skeleton. What's this? Does anybody recognize what this is? Anybody know? What kind of group is this? That's an amino group. What kind of group is this? Carboxylic acid. So this is an amino acid. See, you did know it. You just didn't realize you know it. That's an amino acid. Amino acids get hooked together to form proteins, right? So what makes an amino acid is it has an amino group and it has a carboxylic acid group. And then this R can be any one of 20 different side groups that give you the 20 different amino acids. All right, so these are just some of the functional groups that are important in proteins, or excuse me, important in biology. So alcohols, aldehydes, ketones, methyl, amino, esters, ethers, sulfhydryl groups, very important in proteins. Carboxyl group, very important in proteins, amino acids, right, is our amino acid group. Phosphate groups, very important in things like ATP and DNA. So they kind of talk about where they're important here in this chart. So hopefully you, again, covered a little bit of this in chemistry, but I'm just giving you a little reminder of the idea that there are functional groups in organic chemistry and they give molecules, these biological molecules, different properties. All right, I like this. This is a story here. So you were out after school on a Friday night, and you had a big spaghetti dinner. Right, glucose put together a starch. Big spaghetti dinner, and you washed it down with some beer. And then when you woke up the next morning, you had to take some of this. And they're all the same three atoms: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Just organized differently. You would never eat this, right? I don't recommend using this for your primary nutrition. So you get the idea here. It's not that there's lots of different atoms, it's really how they're organized in 3 dimensions that give these molecules really incredibly different properties. So biological molecules, we can kind of think of them like plastics. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but when you think about a plastic, what you are is you're taking small molecules and you're using them to build big molecules. So you take monomers and you build polymers. That's what plastics are. Your body does that all the time. It takes glucose molecules and builds glycogen. Plants take glucose molecules and they build starch and they build cellulose. So they take repeating molecules, monomers, and they build these big biological molecules called polymers. So macromolecules are just polymers. They consist of small repeating molecules, right? So we can think of this a little bit like we think about plastics. Today, and probably bleeding over a little bit into next Tuesday, we're going to talk about 3 kinds of macromolecules. There's actually 4 that are really important. We're going to focus on 3 this time. So we're going to talk about carbohydrates, we're going to talk about fats or lipids, and we're going to talk about proteins. What's the 4th one? Anybody can guess? Nucleic acids is the 4th one. And it just turns out that it makes a lot more sense to talk about nucleic acids when we talk about genetics because the structure and the function are so related to each other. But we're going to review proteins and carbohydrates and fats now. So hopefully you remember that carbohydrates include things like sugars, and that small glucose molecules are built up into large molecules of starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Of course, these have lots of jobs in the cell. They're both structural. Think about cellulose in a plant builds the cell wall. In your cells, in your cell membranes, oftentimes the proteins are decorated with carbohydrate pieces, and they can